So hi everyone and good afternoon and welcome to Southpole's live webinar session on measuring supply chain emissions with accuracy. This is the second part of a three-part series on supply chains. The first webinar, Understanding Supply Chain Risks, took place last week, and the third and final one on decarbonizing and engaging stakeholders is happening next week. So I hope you find them informative and that we'll get to see you again next week. All of these sessions and recordings can also be available to see on our webpage. So my name is Sarah Ekman. I'm a Senior Business Development and Key Account Associate at Southpole, and I will be your host today. Supply chain emissions are on average approximately 11 times higher than operational emissions. And we want to use this session today to bring our focus to the approximate. We know that supply chains are complex, from the quantity of goods and services to the diversity of logistics and transportation segments. Companies, both large and small, are increasingly in need of a greater understanding of supply chain activities for GHG accounting and as well for reporting. With the emergence of compliance reporting, having a like-for-like comparison between corporations and countries is increasingly important for climate action to take place. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we will highlight the importance of supply chain decarbonization, how you can go back a few slides, please, Elodie. If you could just go back to slide 2, a little too fast for me. Yeah, sorry. So over the next 45 minutes, we will highlight the importance of supply chain decarbonization, how accuracy is defined in the context of supply chain emissions, and methods and how accuracy can be enhanced. The conversation will be centered around the work that we at Southpole have done together with our partner AdAstra Sustainability, that we have worked together with Mars Incorporated over the last year. At the end, we will try to answer as many questions as we can, but if we're not able to answer yours today, we will respond after the session. And you can stay on the slide for a few more seconds. Just some housekeeping rules before we get started. You are all on mute and you will be for the duration of the session as well. But please do post any questions that you may have in the Q&A box and we'll answer as many as we can during the session today towards the end. And again, if we can't get to your questions today, then we'll respond after. And the session will be recorded and sent to all who has registered as well. Now you can go to the next slide, please. Great. Joining me today, we have Pedro, Xavier, and Mark, and they will share some insights from this project that they had during the last year to support the development of a cocoa climate strategy for Mars. Mark, I'm going to leave the word to you for some further introductions.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Day. I'm a senior managing consultant in Southpole's agriculture value chain and circularity team based in London. And I've been with the company for 4 years. And this year I had the pleasure to work with Mars, with Pedro, Xavier, and a number of other colleagues to support them on this project. So I was the project manager. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to sharing more insights about that. I'll hand over to Xavier to introduce himself.
Thank you, Mark. Good day, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Xavier, co-founder at AdAstra Sustainability. We're a nature tech startup based in Geneva, Switzerland, working into revealing the impacts from deforestation and land conversion in agricultural supply chains and supporting decarbonize the food sector in general. And I'll pass over to Pedro.
Thank you, Xavier. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me here. I'm Pedro Amaral. I work as head of cocoa climate sustainability in Mars, and I'm in charge of leading the environmental agenda for cocoa across the board. So it will be a pleasure to have this conversation with you today.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We can jump to the next slide, please. So before we dive into today's topic, we just want to have a quick look at the definitions of several terms that tend to be used interchangeably when we talk about supply chain decarbonization. Scope 3 decarbonization refers to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to the entire upstream and downstream value chain. Supply chain decarbonization focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions only in the upstream value chain. Most commonly, this would be Scope 3 Category 1, purchased goods and services, Category 2, capital goods, and Category 4, upstream transportation and distribution. Supplier engagement describes direct engagement with suppliers in order to reduce their GHG emissions impacts. And driving meaningful decarbonisation requires a supplier engagement strategy to navigate these challenges and cultivate buy-in, develop new ways of working, set ambitious goals, and also identify emission reduction opportunities together. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. For many companies, a significant portion of Scope 3 emissions are located in their upstream value chain, hence outside of their direct control. According to World Business Council for Sustainable Development, an average 50% of emissions across all three scopes sit in the upstream supply chain. But engaging with supply chain emission is complex, and it includes limited data access, complex value chain, a large number of stakeholders. And for these reasons, many companies are not including supply chain reductions in their targets. Can we move to the next slide, please? But as I think everybody on this call here today knows, measuring the supply chain emissions is important, and so for many reasons. Companies need to know their baseline in order to set a credible climate target, for one. It also helps them to take relevant measures to reduce emissions by focusing on the emission hotspots. Thirdly, there are growing requirements in terms of reporting, such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, and other local standards too. Last but not least, companies should want to measure their emissions accurately, as this will also help with avoiding being accused of greenwashing. And the next one, please. So, how do we do it? In order to measure supply chain emissions, we typically use a combination of activity data and emission factors data to calculate the emissions. And there are two types of data. Primary data are data from specific activities within the company's value chain and include data from farmers or suppliers. This could be volumes of goods purchased or kilometers of goods transported, for example. Secondary data are not specific to activities from the value chain and instead includes industry average data. So this could be regional average emission factors from different available databases. Using emission factors from secondary databases is a very good approach for initial Scope 3 screening and also understanding which categories are most material. It's also good for identifying opportunities for emission reduction and agreeing on a strategy. But ultimately, in order to demonstrate progress towards achieving targets, companies should move towards collecting primary data from suppliers alongside monitoring procedures. The better the data, the better companies can measure the impact of an intervention too. And this leads me to the focus of our webinar today. In a few minutes, we'll hear more about the approach taken to develop a more primary-based emission factors for Mars by Xavier. But just before we get to that, I'd like to hand the word to you, Pedro, to tell us a little bit more about the project and how it got started.
Thanks, Sarah. And I echo what you said. Most of emissions rely on the supply chain. And I'll start just by saying that Mars is a family-owned company with more than 100 years of existence, presence in over 80 countries and more than 150,000 associates. We do have a number of public-facing commitments around sustainability, and I'm going to highlight 3 of them that are somehow interconnected and address cocoa, and how this project with South Pole and AdAstra helped us tie them together. So the first commitment that I'm going to call out is our deforestation and conversion-free commitment for cocoa. It says that by 2025, the cocoa that we buy is going to be DCF. The second commitment that I want to highlight is our responsible sourcing cocoa commitment, which also has a 2025 deadline for implementation, and not only includes a DCF requirement, but goes beyond that and includes aspects around legality and also aspects around helping farmers adopt good farming practices, for instance. And then the third commitment that I want to call out is Mars net zero target, which has been validated and endorsed by SBTi and states that by 2050, we're going to reduce a huge chunk of our total emissions and offset only the remaining bit of it. We also have a 2030 intermediary target, which says that we're going to be halving our emissions compared to the 2015 baseline. And these commitments are all in the public facing, in the public domain, so you can check on Mars website the details about them all. And I'm happy to say that we are on track for meeting all of them. And over the past years, we've done a tremendous effort to move from conventional cocoa to what we call responsibly sourced cocoa, and to ensure that by doing that, we're also pulling one of the key levers for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, which is coming from land use change. So the bulk of the emissions from cocoa are estimated to come from land use change. Point being, ensuring that we implement our deforestation and conversion-free commitment is the key lever for ensuring that we're going to be reducing the emissions from cocoa. And to estimate land use change emissions, we actually buy the polygons from the farms in our responsible cocoa program, which are also either certified deforestation-free by Rainforest Alliance or by the Fair Trade Standard, or verified by EcoCert, who verifies our suppliers' programs. But again, we buy the polygons, and then we have a partnership with AdAstra for running a geospatial assessment as to where and when deforestation happened in those polygons to be able to estimate the direct land use change emissions. And again, we've been making a great progress in terms of implementing that commitment and ensuring that's factored in how we estimate our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the other big component of cocoa emissions is associated with land management. So the emissions from the farming practices, from the degradation of pod residues, or from the use of fertilizers. And we've been fostering and supporting a number of interventions that also have an impact on that. Nonetheless, up until recently, we were still relying on land management impact factors coming from a very well-respected external database, the World Food Life Cycle Assessment, which is a terrific starting point for estimating land management emissions from cocoa and from a number of other categories from many origins across the board. And again, we buy cocoa from a multitude of countries in Africa, in Latam, and in Asia. So as a starting point, we were relying on these impact factors from the World Food Life Cycle database. Now, how can we capture the benefits of the things we had been funding from the perspective of lowering the land management emissions? And how can we further plan for what we have to do next in terms of deploying a climate smart ag roadmap? We realized that we needed a better characterization of the land management emissions of our cocoa supply chain, as opposed to relying on country level averages, which is what we get from the World Food Life Cycle database. And to do so, we partnered with AdAstra and South Pole to be able to leverage a data lake, a cocoa data lake, which relies on a number of information that we have been collecting from our supply chain over the past years as we implement our responsible cocoa program. And leveraging data from our suppliers and leveraging also other external credible references, such as studies commissioned with the Wageningen University and with the Conservation International, we made an effort to move as much as possible away from a secondary and more general characterization of the cocoa supply chain at a country level to something much more specific to Mars supply chain. And from my point of view, this has two main benefits. One of them is it helps us better capture the benefits of the programs that we have been funding over the past years to some extent. And the second one is it helps us set ourselves for success for what needs to happen next. So how can we prioritize what interventions to fund and what interventions to deploy, taking into account that we want to maximize the value of the investments and the value of the interventions from a GHG point of view. Having a better GHG profile of the land management emissions of our cocoa supply chain, of our responsible cocoa supply chain, was a key starting point and what we worked on with AdAstra and South Pole. Now, the other component of this process was to also be able to project what would be the most cost-effective interventions to then deploy in our expanded supply chain. So what would be the potential mitigation of composting, of low carbon fertilizers, of biochar, of agroforestry with different setups in different origins, to be able to then select the options that would be most beneficial from a GHG point of view, and at the same time from a farmer productivity point of view, because we were always trying to combine interventions that would be good for our scope 3 targets and at the same time would help with farmers' productivity. So then projecting to the future what that would look like was also one of the components of the work with South Pole and AdAstra. And just to wrap things up, again, we need good data to be able to make good decisions. The data is not perfect. It will never be, but the work has been to leverage the best data available as of today, which is better than the data we had some time ago, to be able to make well-informed decisions around how to implement our commitments in the most effective way. So I'll stop here so we can hear from Xavier and Mark, and I'll be happy to keep on the conversation as we move along the webinar.
Thank you, Pedro. Elodie, we can move to the next slide. I will talk you through a bit the how-to. There was the intention, the objectives that were outlined by Pedro, and then came the question of how do we do that in practice? How do we organize all that complex information into a model that gives the best possible representation of Mars's cocoa supply chain at a certain point in time? So Elodie, if you can switch to the next slide. Going back to a statement that Pedro was just making, the greenhouse gas emission profile of cocoa is quite peculiar. It's quite different from what you would see for wheat or corn or many other agricultural commodities. Because it's a tropical crop grown largely in smallholder farming systems in the deep south. When you look at the profile, on average, you will find that about 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions are linked to land use change. What is land use change? It is the embedded greenhouse gas emissions from the past 20 years of converting natural ecosystems, primarily forest, into cocoa plantations. Naturally, this has become the top priority for Mars to solve, and hence the link with their DCF strategy. But we should not forget the other parts of the equation: land management, transport, and post-farm processing. If you move to the next slide, Elodie, please. This is where you enter a world of complexity. Because if land use change is basically tied to where you grow cocoa or where you source cocoa from, the land management emissions are tied to more of the how. What are the different farm management practices that are being used, implemented, deployed, and that are evolving across the world in a complex supply chain that counts hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individual producers? And behind that term of land management, there's numerous things that are numerous practices that are causing greenhouse gas emissions. The first one in cocoa is crop residues. When you harvest cocoa, you harvest the pod, and within the pod there are the beans. But then there's a whole part of the fruit actually that needs to be managed, and depending on how you manage it, this can result in substantial greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the crop residues, and there's of course fertilizer use, machinery, pest control, weed control, and many other practices on the farm. And the idea is how do you characterize such a diverse ways of managing cocoa farms? Because you can imagine a smallholder farmer in Côte d'Ivoire who has been cultivating cocoa for 10 or 15 years certainly has very different practices and habits than a farmer in Ecuador or a farmer in Indonesia. So the whole challenge was to capture that complexity and simplify it in a smart way. We can move to the next slide. But first thing first, land use change. Indeed, the major part of the GHG emission profile. In the case of Mars, we're talking over 500,000 farms that were geomapped, basically drawing a polygon of GPS points around each farm. And for each of these farms, we ran a 20 years analysis of the deforestation history in order to translate that into proper greenhouse gas emission profiles in line with the accounting requirements of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science Based Targets Initiative. And this is really to show that depending on where you grow cocoa, independently on the how, the emission profile and the carbon intensity of the cocoa changes a lot, as illustrated here for Côte d'Ivoire. Can move to the next slide. Thank you. And then comes the major challenge. As Pedro outlined, Mars has been investing in collecting and collecting a very large amount of data through a number of internal programs for following different objectives. But all that data was out there, but that was not leveraged in Mars's greenhouse gas accounting. So we defined a pyramid, basically a hierarchy of different types of data that is a bit more granular than just the distinction between secondary and primary data, to be able to qualify different types of data and feed this model with as much primary data as possible, as long as it was compliant with the accounting requirements and the quality requirements deemed for corporate carbon accounting. So at the bottom of the pyramid, of course, are these secondary data that Mars already uses widely, that come from reference databases or sector guidance. On top of that are pressure-tested secondary data, and the idea is really you take secondary data, but you customize it and you pressure test it with internal and external experts who know about Mars's supply chain to make them a better representation of what is expected to be happening in the value chain. Then there's supplier data directly provided by Mars's supplier. Of course, it's great to capitalize on this, but Mars was really keen into understanding what were the data collection procedures and accounting procedures followed by these suppliers to make sure that these were meeting the quality standards set by Mars and set by international standards. And finally, of course, there's all of these numerous programs run by Mars and run by Mars's suppliers, which intrinsically needs to inform Mars's carbon strategy. So we qualified all of this data, this famous data lake that Pedro was referring to earlier. And if we move to the next slide. And on that basis, we basically characterized the entire cocoa supply chain of Mars. And this is, as I said, hundreds of thousands of farmers across essentially 12 countries, but there's more than that. So imagine the variability, the diversity of farming systems across the board. So using that pyramid that I described earlier, we clustered this huge diversity into 6 typologies of farming systems, which basically are similar in some way, but also different in some other ways. And you might say that within a certain typology, there are more similarities than differences. And these 6 typologies aim to cover different types of smallholder farming systems, whether cocoa is grown in full sun system or in agroforestry system, and also whether these smallholder farmers have been benefiting or not from improvement programs, basically education, training, practice, technology to support their practice to improve yields and reduce emissions or manage, for instance, crop residues in a particular way. So this results in 4 different typologies, plus 2 other typologies for very different types of farms. On one hand, which are the so-called large-scale farms, which are emerging in different parts of the globe, which are kind of more professionally managed farms at large scale that use many more inputs, but also have much higher productivity. And finally, the certified geomap farms, for which Mars had collected primary data. And with this 6 typologies of farms, we could characterize them with quite some nuance across 12 different countries. So the so-called traditional smallholder full sun typology is different from Côte d'Ivoire than it is for Cameroon, or it is for Brazil, for instance. So it's really like, how do you bring nuance into a simplified model of a very complex system? If we move to the next slide. The output of that was really about revealing not only the carbon impact of particular typologies of farms for particular locations, but really understanding the emission profile behind it. And why is that really important for Moss? It's really that if you don't have a good understanding of that emission profile, it's impossible to know where is it that you need to focus and what is the right strategy to keep on decarbonizing different parts of value chain. And here, as an example, we'll illustrate 2 different types of farms: smallholder farming system in West Africa, large-scale farm in LATAM, and the emission profile is totally different. It's not just the total carbon emissions per ton of cocoa. It's really the drivers behind these emissions are different, because in some instances, the priorities should be about working on managing crop residues in a more effective way, and in others, it's much more about using smart and low carbon fertilizers to increase yields and to remove direct emissions on the field. So this really helped inform the different strategies and actually fed an even more complex model that South Pole worked on, and that Mark will illustrate in a moment, that helped understand the effects of different interventions on these GHG profiles for different farms. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Xavier. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Eddie. Great. So this section of the webinar, I'm going to be sharing with you the second of 2 ways to improve Mars's granularity and accuracy in their accounting of cocoa emissions. This was where we validated supplier emissions calculators to identify any gaps, and then also took their emission profiles and converted those into the Mars specification so that they could then incorporate those into their inventory on a future rolling basis. Next slide, please. Thanks. So yeah, just to give you a sense of the process that we undertook, similar to the steps that Xavier shared, we had access to a volume of data from Mars's data lake, but also external partners to kind of compare and validate what we were seeing. But in this specific process on the right-hand side, we show a ladder of different actions. So we started by developing templates and gathering supply data to evaluate alignment of the carbon calculators of these 3 suppliers against the requirements of Mars's specification, as well as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol draft land sector and removals guidance, and the Science-Based Targets Forest, Land and Agriculture guidance. With that, we identified any partial or complete gaps in these tools and highlighted those to Mars as points for engagement with their suppliers to further align these tools with these requirements over the next year or so. Then we started to convert the land management emission components of the emission factors that these suppliers shared with us into the formats and templates as required by Mars for inclusion in their GHG inventory. So we incorporated these factors, which therefore allowed Mars to replace, Mars to replace some of their secondary base emissions factors with more primary base emissions factors to increase the accuracy in their estimations, but also then to provide greater clarity as to what those concentrated areas of emissions are within the on-farm activities that Xavier pointed out a second ago. Great. Next slide, please. So those are the two ways we estimated emissions for Mars through this project. Now I just want to spotlight for you the third piece of interesting work that we did, which was to develop a scenario modeling tool. The purpose here was to estimate the carbon cost and livelihood potential of adopting different climate smart agricultural practices in Mars's cocoa supply chains. Next slide, please. So how do we develop it? We started by engaging an extensive number of stakeholders, including IDH, Rainforest Alliance, innovation partners, Mars's own science and technology team, agronomists, and many more individuals to develop a comprehensive list of interventions and characterizing these based on a number of parameters such as carbon impact, impacts on yield, risk factors, costs and livelihoods. Once the list was developed and we received the updated emission factors from Xavier's piece of work, we set out to design and build a scenario modeling tool to identify and analyze the emission reduction and removal potentials of selected interventions. But also we built in and incorporated estimations on the cost impacts of adopting such interventions and the potential livelihood benefits that come with that. So broadly, to develop the tool, the South Pole team took the following steps, starting with defining the tool specification, the calculation approach and functionality to ensure an ease of use by users and that the output and visualizations would meet Mars's own requirements. We then developed the tool structure and equations, connecting these to the input and output sides of the tool. This then, following this, we conducted user testing and calibration. So this was effectively deploying the tool to a number of users to try and use and implement the model to identify any potential glitches that might come up and any opportunities to incorporate new needs and user needs into the design. So that meant that we sort of underwent a second iteration of updates. Finally, then the tool was deployed for use in supporting the assessment of supplier proposals and the development of regional and global glide paths in terms of understanding how Mars can decarbonize the land management activities. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to spotlight quickly for you some of the inputs that went into building the tool. So this was a very complex tool and had many interconnecting components to it. The core of it started with incorporating the updated emission factors, followed by identifying factors to convert co-products like cocoa butter and liquor into a dry bean equivalent, which is the standard unit of modeling interventions against. Then we looked at cocoa yields and associated land area per emission factor. We also researched and incorporated the reduction and removals potentials of different farm interventions, as well as for removals from the adoption of shade trees, looked at data on allometric equations and mean annual growth potentials to model the potential carbon sequestration that can occur resulting from tree planting. And then in terms of input data that users would input to run the scenario tool, these included defining the base year and up to 3 target years under assessment, incorporating purchase volume by co-product and country of production, the annual expected growth rates by purchase volume, percentage changes denoting any shift in volumes from one sourcing country to another, a selection of interventions to be modeled, and the relevant adoption rates of those. Next slide, please. Then on the outputs end, users would receive a series of tables, charts, and visualizations that would include baseline emissions and absolute and intensity changes against these, resulting from the adoption of interventions. Growth emissions, where modeling absolute emissions change. The reductions and removals resulting from adopting interventions, residual emissions gaps, as well as finally a separate KPI around the livelihoods benefit of these package of interventions when being modeled collectively, and also estimating on the cost potentials. The tool allowed for an assessment of both program and project level instances. So the first program output allowed for developing regional and global glide paths, which included then total purchase volumes and projected growth in these volumes over the assessment period, and would model the effect of adopting interventions at different adoption rates across multiple countries. So that was much more of a meta assessment that users would use that for. And the other output is the project output, and this can be used to compare and contrast supplier proposals in a more standardized way by considering different interventions that they are proposing to adopt, adoption rates, and different project assessment periods. Just to finally mention that there were different methodologies we followed to estimate the impacts of interventions resulting in emissions changes, impacting on yields, and also those leading to removals. So yeah, there were many different approaches taken to build a very robust and kind of dynamic tool here. Next slide, please. Great. On this final slide, I'd just like to illustrate the results of one scenario at an intensity level. So this is per kilogram CO2 equivalent change per kilogram of cocoa bean equivalent. So each of these colored blocks shown in the diagram represent different categories of emissions coming from land management activities. So you can see in red the machinery activity emissions, establishment of the site, upstream fertilizer production, and then downstream emissions from application of fertilizer, residue management, and removals. So on average, as previously mentioned, most emissions from the production of cocoa are associated with how farmers manage tree residues. So this pertains to aging or diseased branches and leaves, and sort of how they dispose of that, and how they whether they mulch that or compost that or leave it stockpiled. There'll be different emission profiles for those different activities. And emissions resulting from the decomposition of this biomass can range in materiality of between 40 to 70% per kilogram of cocoa bean equivalent. The second area to highlight here is the importance of fertilizer production and application in many cocoa producing farms where fertilizer is used. This is quite a critical source of emissions. And yeah, through the incorporation and decomposition of nitrogen-based fertilizers into soils, microbes would release nitrous oxide, thus emitting greenhouse gas emissions. So fertilizer production and application overall can be approximately 15 to 60% of emissions per kilogram of dry cocoa bean, and these range significantly based upon the type of farm and the type of impacts that are occurring within the typology that Xavier was referring to, and those different typologies. So a large farm might be using fertilizer, and a small holder farm may not be using fertilizer, and therefore the emissions profile would be different there. So in this case example, practices to address these emission sources like composting of residues and the use of low carbon fertilizers would be critical in delivering targeted reductions. Agroforestry will further also drive performance through the planting of fruit, timber, nitrogen fixing trees and species within those categories in situ with cocoa trees, and those would deliver mostly above ground and below ground carbon accumulation in the biomass of that. But those returns would be yielded over a longer time horizon, given that it takes sometimes decades to accrue that carbon storage. Great, so I'm going to hand over back to Pedro now to share some reflections from this work. I think the first thought was, if for you to share any kind of thoughts on the benefit that it's provided you last year.
Thanks, Mark. So I see this climate journey as a marathon as opposed to a sprint. And we're going to be improving along the way, and we're going to be learning more and more along the way as we go over this marathon. And we're going to get better data as we move along. So I'm very happy with the partnership that we set up with AdAstra and South Pole, so we can ensure that we not only capture the benefits of what we have been doing this far, but we have a strong foundation for setting the travel of direction towards the right place, and to be able to push forward this agenda, to be able to partner with like-minded suppliers, and further help deploy interventions that are going to be good for the farmers, that are going to help increase productivity, and at the same time are going to help us achieve our Scope 3 targets and our other targets. So again, we need data. Data is not perfect. Data will keep on improving, and we've been making an extraordinary effort to not only collect data, but to be able to leverage the best data available to inform our strategic decisions. The other thing that I would call out is, at least in the cocoa sector, we are fortunate to have a very strong critical mass of companies working to align on a common methodology for greenhouse gas accounting in the cocoa sector, and the umbrella of work we do in the World Cocoa Foundation. The current guidance is undergoing a review process, also with the support from Quantis, and it's soon expected to be published. So we all the companies in the cocoa and the chocolate sector can then use that as an additional reference point for improving the way we estimate emissions, and to ensure that we are all working under the same framing and estimating emissions using the best possible approaches. Mark, Xavier, back to yours, Sarah. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Pedro. Let's have everybody back. Thank you so much for those insights and presentations, Mark, Xavier, and Pedro. We have just a couple of more minutes to go, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening may also be interested in potential challenges that you've had. All projects face them, so anything that you would like to share in this group and how you kind of overcame those challenges. I'm going to leave the floor open for anyone to jump in on that.
I'm going to be just provide a few thoughts on these. So curating a strong data lake, curating the data and pressure testing the data that we get from our suppliers and from our data collection processes, and ensuring that we would all be, taking into account the most reliable data was one of the key challenges. And again, I think that moving forward, the fact that we're also going to have a revised WCF guidance for estimating greenhouse gas emissions in the cocoa sector is also going to be extremely beneficial for all the companies in this space.
That's great. Thank you. You've paved the way for others, hopefully, to follow in your footsteps as well. With 1 minute to go, any final key takeaways from to anyone else wanting to kind of embark on the similar journey? Mark.
Yeah, sure. I'll just add that, I mean, this has been a project based on collaboration from the start. We've worked together with AdAstra, and we've had a copious number of stakeholders that we've engaged and incorporated as part of the process. So it's really been a co-creation of work, and I really encourage others to think in the same mindset and work collaboratively to kind of address and solve these complex supply chain issues.
Thank you so much. And with that, we're at time. So thank you so much, Xavier, Mark, and Pedro, for sharing today your story and the project. Let's hope it's helped shed some light maybe on how to work with complex Scope 3 and inspired others to look a little bit closer at their supplier data as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today. the video will be shared, and any questions that we didn't get to today, again, we will make sure to get back to you after the session has ended. Thank you all and have a good evening.